Let me start by saying, first of all, that the UN is not the problem. The UN's mission is to fix the problem. Admittedly, the United Nations Security Council, which has primary responsibility under the Charter for matters of peace and security, has not lived up to its expectation in delivering its mandate. The Council had not been able to agree a resolution on Gaza in particular. But that is not the case. In fact, it's precisely the polar opposite with the General Assembly. The General Assembly has passed 2 resolutions on Gaza and 6 on the war in Ukraine. And these resolutions have been very strong and very clear because they have called in the case of Gaza for an immediate ceasefire. They have called for the immediate unconditional release of the hostages, and they've called repeatedly for there to be ready access for humanitarian aid and support for the people of Gaza. Now, resolutions of the Security Council have the force of law. Resolutions of the General Assembly do not have the force of law, but they are important because they constitute the compelling will of the overwhelming majority of member states of the United Nations and the populations that those delegations represent. So they have extraordinary political impact. And so the General Assembly has been active. We've not sat on our hands in frustration. We've acted where the Security Council has been unable to act. And therefore it is not accurate to say that the United Nations has been unable to address the problems either of Gaza or of Ukraine, because in fact we have decisively in the context of the resolutions. Where the Security Council has failed, the General Assembly has acted with alacrity and clarity in insisting upon adherence to the rule of law.
I think that's a fair point, because most of the criticism that is coming from experts over the role of the United Nations is directed towards the United Nations Security Council ineffectiveness when it comes to passing resolutions over stopping wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Now, Mr. President, certainly, as you know, there are efforts underway at the United Nations, outside in the diplomatic world, when it comes to bringing an end to Israeli attacks on Gaza. But so far, most of those efforts have not produced any sort of positive results. As the President of the United Nations General Assembly, are you hopeful something concrete is going to come out of those efforts?
I'm indeed hopeful. This is the magic of diplomacy and dialogue. That is why we always insist upon diplomacy and dialogue, because it is the conversation that leads to the solution. You can't get the solution if your efforts are concentrated only on the battlefield. There has to be a conversation. Both sides must come to the table, and I'm very hopeful that something positive will come out of it, because in fact there are negotiations taking place with a view to establishing a ceasefire, which is absolutely necessary, first of all, to save lives, and second of all, to ensure that humanitarian aid and assistance reaches the desperately needed people in Gaza. So I'm hopeful. Anything that will add value to the process of restoring peace, saving lives, and providing aid and support to the civilians in Gaza who need it, the United Nations and the General Assembly will support wholeheartedly. I am indeed hopeful.
President Dennis Francis, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Take care.